For 137 years, a people in the swamps of North Carolina were told to prove who they were. Prove it with a tribe, prove it with a treaty, prove it eventually with their blood. More than 50,000 strong, the largest native community east of the Mississippi. And still the question chased them everywhere they went. Are you really who you say you are? Both sides were sure the answer was hiding in their ancestry, waiting for a test that could finally read it out. The genetics have now been read, and the truth they reveal is stranger and bigger than either side was ready for. Let's be clear about what kind of story this is, because the honest version is better than the myth. The Lumbee tribe of North Carolina, centered in Robeson County around the town of Pembroke, has somewhere between 55 and 60,000 members. For most of the last century and a half, they held only state recognition, granted by North Carolina in 1885, while the federal government kept them at arm's length. And the central charge against them, repeated for generations, was that they could not point to one ancestral tribe the way other nations could. No treaty, no reservation, no surviving indigenous language, no clean line back to a single historic people. The leading scholarly account of their origins comes from John Swanton, a prominent anthropologist at the Smithsonian Institution, who in 1933 wrote a report for the U.S. Department of the Interior on the probable origins of these people, then known officially only as the Indians of Robeson County. His conclusion was that they descended mainly from Siouan-speaking peoples of the Carolina interior, above all the Cheraw, along with related groups like the Kiawe. That remains the mainstream view today, supported by Lumbee historians like Melinda Maynor Lowery, whose book, The Lumbee Indians, An American Struggle, is among the definitive modern accounts. But notice the shape of that answer. It isn't a single tribe. It's a coalition of remnants, a list of peoples rather than one people. And that detail, which sounds at first like a hole in the case, turns out to be the entire key, both to who the Lumbee really are and to what the DNA, read honestly, actually reveals. Because here's the instinct this whole story runs up against. When a question of native identity comes up in modern America, people reach for a cheek swab almost by reflex, as if the truth of who someone is must be sitting in their cells, waiting to be printed out like a verdict. That instinct feels like hard science, and it shaped how almost everyone assumed the Lumbee question would eventually be put to rest, that a test would finally declare them in or out. What the genetics actually deliver is more honest and more interesting than a verdict. But to understand it, you first have to understand a catastrophe that almost no American has ever heard about. When Europeans arrived, the interior of the Carolinas was home to dozens of small Siouan-speaking nations: the Cheraw, the Kiawe, the Saponi, the Pd, the Waccamaw, and many more, each with its own town, its own leaders, its own place in a dense web of trade and kinship that had organized the Piedmont for centuries. Then came the three forces that unmade that world in the span of a few generations. First, European diseases swept through populations with no immunity, killing in waves that could erase the majority of a town in a single season. Smallpox above all, which moved faster than the colonists themselves and emptied whole districts before many native people had ever laid eyes on a European. Second came the Indian slave trade, a brutal, deliberately forgotten chapter in which colonists and rival groups captured native people by the tens of thousands and sold them into bondage in the Caribbean and the northern colonies. Historians now estimate that in the decades around 1700, the English in Carolina exported more enslaved native people than they imported enslaved Africans. And third came the colonial wars, especially the Tuscarora War and the Yamasee War in the 17-teens, which shattered what the disease and the slaving had left and scattered the survivors in every direction. By the middle of the 18th century, the Piedmont nations have been reduced to fragments, a few dozen survivors here, a scattered handful of families there, peoples grown too few to hunt, defend, or marry within their own ranks. And the survivors did what survivors throughout human history have always done when their world collapses. They came together. They drifted into the isolated swampy bottomlands along the Lumber River then called Drowning Creek, a place too forbidding and too poor for planners to covet, and there the remnants of many broken nations fused into one new community. They intermarried with one another across old tribal lines that no longer had enough people left to matter, and over the generations also with free people of color and with European settlers, many of them Scots-Irish who had themselves landed near the bottom of the colonial order. Out of that merger, in that refuge, hidden in the swamps from a world that had tried to destroy them, a new people was quietly forming. The records barely notice. A colonial surveyor passing through in 1754 described what he found only as a mixed crew, a lawless people, which tells you exactly how little the men with the pens understood what they were looking at. So here's the first thing almost everyone gets wrong about the Lumbee, and it flips the entire question. For more than a century, critics framed the Lumbee's murky origins as proof that something was off, that a people who couldn't name their single ancestral tribe must not be a real tribe at all. But that framing smuggles in a hidden assumption that every native nation is a straight, unbroken line back to one ancient people, like a single family tree with one trunk. The Lumbee aren't that, and the reason they aren't is not fraud, it's history. They are what anthropologists call a coalescent society, a people formed through ethnogenesis, the birth of a genuinely new ethnic group out of the merger of older ones. And far from being unusual, ethnogenesis is one of the most common ways peoples have come into being all over the world. Many nations we now think of as ancient and unified were themselves stitched together from fragments at some point in their past. Think of it this way. Imagine a dozen small creeks running through a drought-stricken country, each one alone, too shallow to survive the dry season. Where those creeks flow together, they form a single river deep enough to endure. That river is real. It is not a fake creek, and it is not less of a waterway because you cannot point to one spring as its only source. It is something new, made from many, and more durable than any of its parts. The Lumbee are that river, the very thing held against them. That they came from many peoples rather than one is the fingerprint of how they survived a near total apocalypse that destroyed the nations around them. They didn't lose their origin story. Their origin story was the merger itself, forced by catastrophe, of peoples who would otherwise have vanished from the earth completely. To demand that they produce a single founding tribe is to demand that they prove they didn't survive the way they actually survived. It is to ask a river to name the one creek it came from and to call it a fraud when it cannot. Now we get to the DNA and to the truth it actually reveals, which is not the truth either side was hoping for. When a person descends from several distinct ancestral populations, geneticists call the result admixture, a blend of inherited components from different parts of the world, written into the chromosomes in long stretches and readable centuries later by comparing a genome against reference populations from around the globe. Run modern ancestry testing on Lumbee individuals, and you find exactly what 300 years of this history would predict: a genuine mixture of Native American, European, and African ancestry, in proportions that vary widely from family to family and even from sibling to sibling. For more than a century, anthropologists even had a clinical and frankly loaded label for communities like this across the Southeast. They called them triracial isolates, a term many of those communities understandably resented for the way it flattened a living people into a recipe. And here's the first half of the truth the genetics reveal, the half the harshest critics never wanted to hear. The Native American ancestry is real. It is there, woven through the population exactly as you would expect in a people descended from the shattered Siouan nation of the Piedmont. The dismissive claim that the Lumbee are simply a recent mixed-race group with no genuine indigenous root, an invention of the late 19th century, does not survive contact with the actual ancestry. They carry the blood of the people who were here first, the survivors of the towns that disease, enslaving, and war had emptied. Whatever else is uncertain, that much the genetics put beyond serious doubt. The indigenous descent is not a story they made up, it is written into them. But the genetics reveal a second half too, and it is the half the Romantics never wanted. There is no single ancestral tribe hiding in the data because there cannot be. A DNA test cannot stamp a person Chirol rather than Kayawi or Lumbee rather than Catawba because there is no such thing as a tribal gene. Ancestry tests read broad, continental-level signals. Neighboring native nations were never sealed off gene pools, but shared deep ancestry and centuries of intermarriage long before any European arrived. And the reference databases you would need to even attempt tribal level matching mostly do not exist, in part because many tribes have refused to be genetically cataloged, a refusal that is itself an act of sovereignty, a way of insisting that a nation, not a laboratory, decides who its people are. So the test confirms indigenous ancestry while flatly refusing to reduce it to one origin. In other words, the DNA reveals precisely the truth the history predicted. A people who are genuinely native and genuinely made of many. The romantic single origin myths, the lost colony, the lone lost tribe, dissolve in the data. And so does the dismissive fantasy that there's no native ancestry there at all. What's left is the harder, truer middle. The mixture isn't the mark of a fake, it's the genetic signature of the coalescence itself, the river, red in the blood. And that points to the deepest layer of the truth, the one that reaches beyond the Lumbee entirely. There is a darker way the genetics have been used in this fight, because the Lumbee, like any community that has mixed over 3 centuries, carry European and African ancestry alongside the native. Their opponents have at times pointed to those fractions and said, see, not enough Indian blood, not a real tribe. But sit with what that argument actually is. It is the claim that a native people can be disqualified by the very intermarriage that every surviving southeastern community underwent. That survival itself, with all the mixing survival required, is somehow proof of fraud. It is blood quantum logic, the same racial arithmetic the federal government invented to shrink tribal roles and seize tribal land. And it rests on an assumption that the Cherokee scholar Kim Tallbear, in her landmark book on Native American DNA, calls a false promise, the idea that being native is fundamentally a fact about molecules. It is not. A genome can reveal your ancestry. It cannot by itself make you a citizen of a nation, because tribal belonging was never a percentage in a vial. It was kinship, community, language, and a shared life across generations. So the full truth the DNA reveals comes in 2 parts that have to be held together. Yes, the Lumbee carry real indigenous ancestry from many sources, and no, that genetic fact is not what makes them a people. What makes them a people is everything they did with 3 centuries in that swamp. Quick pause, because this is exactly the kind of history this channel exists to recover. Documented, sourced, told straight, without the comfortable myths and without the cynical hit pieces. If that's the work you want more of, subscribe. There's far more of this that the textbooks left out, and most of it has the same shape of people written out of the record by someone else's definition of who counts. Now I want to be scrupulously fair about the parts of this that are genuinely contested because they are real. This is the part that demands honesty, because the Lumbee story is not free of legitimate dispute, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of lie. First, the precise origin really is unresolved, and the Lumbee's own claims have shifted over time. They have, at various points, been called or called themselves Croatan, Cherokee, Siwan, Tuscarora, and Chirol. The lost colony theory, the romantic idea that they descend from Sir Walter Raleigh's vanished Roanoke colonists who merged with coastal Indians, is now largely discounted by historians, despite how long it shaped their public image. And some researchers have argued the documentary trail linking specific Lumbee founding families to the Chirol is thinner than advocates claim. These are real scholarly debates, and an honest account names them instead of papering over them. Second, the opposition to Lumbee recognition is not all bad faith, and it deserves to be represented fairly. The Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians and more than 100 other tribes opposed the Lumbee's federal recognition. Their stated concerns were substantive, that the Lumbee won recognition through an act of Congress rather than the rigorous documentation process the Office of Federal Acknowledgement requires of everyone else, and that adding tens of thousands of people to the pool of federal Indian benefits could pull scarce resources away from tribes that are already desperately poor. You can disagree with those arguments, many people do strongly, but they are serious positions held by serious people, not simply prejudice. And the question of who holds the authority to define a tribe touches the sovereignty of every native nation. It is worth holding that tension honestly rather than waving it away. A people's right to be recognized and a nation's right to guard the meaning of recognition can both be real at once. Third, and most important, none of this contested detail erases what the genetics and the history agree on. The native ancestry is real. The coalescence is real. The 3-century community is real. The uncertainty is about which tribes contributed and in what proportion, not about whether these are a genuinely indigenous descended people. That is the distinction that gets lost in the loudest versions of this fight on both sides. The skeptics inflate a debate about precise tribal lineage into a claim that the whole identity is invented. The romantics flatten a complicated, many-sourced origin into a single heroic legend. The honest answer sits between them and is more interesting than either. The mystery at the center of the Lumbee story was never whether they are native. It was only ever which of the vanished nations of the Carolina interior they are made from. And DNA, for all its limits, can at least tell you that the answer is many. So let's bring it home, because the truth in the blood is only half of it, and the other half was written in courage. If you want the proof that the Lumbee are a real, continuous, self-aware Indian community, you don't stop at the genome. You look at what they did. In the years during and after the Civil War, a young Lumbee man named Henry Berry Lowry led an armed band against the local Confederate Home Guard and the white power structure that had been conscripting his people into forced labor, seizing their goods, and executing them without trial. For nearly a decade, his gang outfought and outran the militias, posses, and bounty hunters sent after him, striking back at the officials and planners who had terrorized Robeson County and becoming, in the process, a kind of native Robin Hood, whose legend the Lumbees still tell with pride. He vanished in 1872 and was never captured, a Lumbee outlaw who beat the most powerful forces the state could throw at him and whose name became a permanent byword for the community's refusal to be broken. Nearly a century later, in January of 1958, the Ku Klux Klan announced a rally near the town of Maxton at a place called Hayes Pond, explicitly meant to terrorize the Lumbee into knowing their place after the Klan had been burning crosses to intimidate Indian families. The Klan got a very different night than the one they had planned. Hundreds of armed Lumbee men converged on the gathering in the dark, surrounded the few dozen Klansmen who had actually shown up, shot out the single light bulb illuminating the field, and sent the white-robed mob scrambling into the swamp, abandoning their banner, their regalia, and their sound system in the mud. Not one person was killed, but the Klan's reign of fear in Robeson County was finished that night. The routing of the Klan at Hayes Pond made national headlines, ran in Life magazine with photographs of grinning Lumbee men holding the captured Klan banner, and the tribe celebrates it every January as a defining moment of exactly who they are. These are not the actions of a people uncertain of their own identity. This is a community that built its own separate Indian schools when the state segregated them into a third category that was neither white nor black, that founded the institution now known as the University of North Carolina at Pembroke as a school by and for Indian people back in 1887, that held its families, its churches, its homeland, and its sense of itself together in the same stretch of swampland for 300 years. And in December of 2025, that endurance was finally answered. Congress passed and the president signed the Lumbee Fairness Act, granting the tribe full federal recognition after a fight that had begun all the way back in 1888, overturning a cruel 1956 law that had acknowledged the Lumbee as Indians, while pointedly denying them the benefits every other recognized tribe received. With it, the Lumbee became the 575th federally recognized tribe in the United States. and the largest east of the Mississippi. They got there not by producing a genetic smoking gun and not by satisfying every skeptic, over 100 tribes still objected to the very end, but by the combined weight of their ancestry, their documented history, and 3 centuries of simply, stubbornly continuing to exist as a people. When the vote passed, members of the tribe who had waited their whole lives wept in the halls of the Capitol. So the truth the DNA revealed turns out to fit perfectly with the truth their history revealed. The genetics say genuinely native, genuinely made of many, impossible to reduce to one. The history says a people forged from the survivors of nations that were nearly erased, who held together for 3 centuries and finally forced a country to admit it. The 2 halves of the evidence, the blood and the record, point at the very same answer. The Lumbee were never who we were told they were, not the romantic lost colony of legend, and not the fraud their harshest critics imagined. They were something harder to see and far more remarkable, a new nation born from the wreckage of old ones, carrying real indigenous blood from many vanished peoples who survived the unsurvivable by becoming one. For more than a century, the world demanded they prove themselves and then refused to accept any proof they offered. The DNA finally revealed the truth, and the truth was that they had been telling it all along.